Today I want to talk from the topic 12:3, or Let Love Lead. And I'll be using as a text Jonah, the first chapter, verses 1 through 16, although I'm only going to read verses 1 through 10. And it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid his fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God, and they threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The captain came to him and said, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." The sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" "I am a Hebrew," he replied. "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. You know, sometimes, or maybe you've never felt it, but sometimes we feel led to do something that just gets in you and just won't leave you alone until you follow through. There are some things in life that we can try to run away from if it's part of your divine path. You will probably do it eventually, though. And as they say, you can do it either the easy way or the hard way. For example, this call to be a pastor is something I tried to run away from the time I was a senior in high school. But although I chose to follow a technical path for a career, the urge never left me alone. After I finished my undergrad degree, I planned to get an MBA and match that along with my engineering degree and make lots of money. But something compelled me to go to seminary instead. And even when I went to seminary, I said I was not going to preach and I was not going to pastor. I just wanted to teach Christian education. But you see how that ended up. Even when I tried to run away, it was like I had a neon sign on my head. For example, I went to a bar in a completely different part of town with a whole different clientele demographic, just to get away from school and church folks and have a drink and relax. But even there, a woman came up and sat in the stool next to me and started telling me about a problem she had been praying about. There was no getting away from this thing. I think that's why I've always liked the story of Jonah. It's emblematic of all of us who have tried to run away from the thing we know we were born to do. It doesn't have to be preaching or pastoring. It can be another vocation or something you need to do in your family or a change you need to make in yourself. We may not run away, but we procrastinate, we sidestep, and we hide from the things that we know we need to do. Y'all don't have to say amen. I know it's true. For the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be preaching from this small 4-chapter book of Jonah. These first 2 weeks will be very familiar to us, but prayerfully there will be something new that we can glean from the examination of the story. Any of us who ever went to Sunday school, or even some of us who have not, have heard something about the first 2 chapters of the book of Jonah. The story of Jonah is a folk tale that tells the story of a fictional prophet. But like any good folk tale, it includes a message or messages that can be applied to real life. Some people don't like to hear any of the Bible being described as a myth or a folk tale, but that's all the book of Jonah was ever meant to be. A traditional prose story in oral or written form, where the realm of fantasy and reality mix together freely. Folk tales can still have just as much meaning, if not more so, than a factual account. The story of Jonah has some factual elements, such as the name Jonah has historical meaning, as it was borrowed from a historical figure from the 8th century BCE during the reign of King Jeroboam II. The historical Jonah successfully proclaimed the restoration of the border of Israel. But Jonah Amittai in our text means dove, son of truth, or son of faithfulness, which is rather ironic because the fictional character of Jonah is nowhere near a faithful son of Yahweh's truth. Still, the Jonah in the text for today is considered a prophet. As the text says, the word of the Lord, or Yahweh, came to Jonah and gave him an assignment to take a message to God's people in Nineveh. The cities referred to in the story are also factual: Joppa, Tarshish, and Nineveh. The book itself is thought to have originated somewhere between the 6th and the 4th century BCE, but the actual author of the book, or the originators, are unknown. There are 3 episodes in this first chapter of the book, beginning with Jonah getting on the wrong boat. The story goes that Jonah was told by God to go to Nineveh to cry out against the city because of their wickedness. Nineveh is the oldest and most populated city in the ancient Assyrian Empire. It's situated on the east bank of the Tigris River and encircled by the modern city of Mosul, Iraq. Nineveh was located at the intersection of the north, south, and east-west trade routes, which resulted in a diverse population with differing views on life. It was clearly a place where Jonah did not want to go, which is understandable because Nineveh was known as evil incarnate, or arrogant, or the city of bloodshed. So Jonah got on a ship heading in the opposite direction, heading to Tarshish, a city in southern Spain. Or it could be a geographic metaphor for where Yahweh is not. Even the text says Jonah paid his fare to go to Tarshish, away from the Lord. You know, as a pastor, that concept of being away from God always makes me chuckle. If you believe there is a God, why would you believe there's a place where God is not? When I was a pastor, people would sometimes say, I didn't come to church because I didn't want God to know what I did the night before. Or I didn't pray about it because I didn't want God to know what I did. Really? What a limited view of what or who God is. One of the movies I've always liked was the original movie Sparkle. There's a scene in that movie where one of the 3 sisters in the story is leaving home, and as she heads out the door with her suitcase, her mother looks at her and says, whatever problems you have are going right along with you in that suitcase. She could have been speaking to Jonah or to some of us. Someone once said, running away from your problems is a race you will never win. Similarly, running away from God is a game we will always lose. What Jonah did not consider was the larger implication of what he was being asked to do. Our divine path in life is not always the most comfortable. Actually, it's often a path of sacrifice and compromise, or even occasional disappointment. It can push us beyond our perceived boundaries and fears. Sometimes life invites us, even compels us, to do something significant and outside of our comfort zone for the greater good. If we believe God is love and we believe love is calling us to do something outside of our comfort zone, it might be best for us to just go in the direction where love is leading, even if it requires us to go very cautiously. We don't grow if we don't sometimes go on unfamiliar or uncomfortable paths. It's a choice we all need to make. We all have a destiny, but what makes it divine is that we have the will to choose. Stephen Hawking said, I have noticed that even those who assert that everything is predestined and that we can change nothing about it still look both ways before crossing the street. Like Jonah, we all have moments when life presents us with options. Do the more challenging thing that may be for the greater good, go to Nineveh, or do the safest and most comfortable thing, take the ship to Tarshish. Jonah chose what he thought was the easy way. Chuck D would call that the negative way. He said, being positive is like going up a mountain. Being negative is like sliding down a hill. A lot of times people want to take the easy way out because it's basically what they've always understood throughout their whole life. Episode 2, we find Jonah on board the boat on its way to Tarshish. He thought he was successful at avoiding what God asked him to do. Jonah thought he had gotten away and was safely sailing on a ship going in the opposite direction. But the text says a storm arose that was so bad the sailors thought the ship was going to break apart. Sometimes our bad decisions have a major impact on the people around us. Jonah's decision not to go to Nineveh not only impacted him, it also brought trouble to innocent people around him. While it's true that we have free will to choose our path, we always need to stay mindful that our decisions sometimes impact much more than ourselves. Think about some of the decisions we've made in our lives that have impacted even the people around us that love us. For example, some of us have chosen to enter or remain in relationships that we know down inside were toxic for us. Sometimes the bad situations we put ourselves in impact the people who love us because they have to either listen to us complain about it or they have to watch how someone they love is doing themselves harm. Or when it comes to COVID-19, we've heard about the value of wearing masks when we're out in public. But yesterday I was reading an article that said 66% of Americans still don't wear masks. And there's a large percentage of people who still embrace this conspiracy theory, thinking that COVID-19 is a hoax. It's no wonder that we still have so many people who are still contracting and dying from COVID-19. On another scale, think of the many people who choose not to vote. Even though so many people have sacrificed for us to either have the right or the freedom to participate in and defend our democracy, like Jonah, we try to quietly blend into society, heading into trouble without taking responsibility for our actions or our lack of action. That's a message I try to get across to people who say they're not going to vote because they say their vote doesn't make a difference. Well, yes, it does. Choosing not to vote is typically a vote for what and who we don't really want. So don't complain when things get rough. As Nicholas Sparks in his book, Message in the Bottle said, there are winds of destiny that blow when we least expect them. Sometimes they gust with the fury of a hurricane. Sometimes they barely fan one's cheek. But the winds cannot be denied, bringing us, as they do, a future that is impossible to ignore. In Jonah's case, as he tried to flee against his destiny, his call, it was the rough seas of a storm that arose that almost destroyed the ship of innocent sailors on the ship. Jonah's choice left the rest of the sailors to have to work and to pray to try to get the storm to cease. The text says they began throwing things overboard. Some say they were trying to lighten the load on the ship. Others say they were trying to appease their gods. Whatever their motives, they had to work hard to try to make a difference, while Jonah slept, although he knew he was probably complicit in the storm that was trying to take them out. I know I'm stuck on this voting thing today, but we only have a few more weeks left to get this point across. While I understand and support all of the protesting going on in this country, I constantly pray that everyone, including the protesters and those who are resorting to violence even, I pray that they turn their concern into a commitment to vote on November 3rd. Otherwise, they'll be complicit in whatever we end up with for the next 4 years. We need everyone to stand up and be self-aware and responsible. That's what is needed if we are to remain a democracy. In his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, The Courage to Create a Politics Worthy of the Human Spirit, Parker Palmer notes, when a democratic society is working as it should, calling people to individual freedom and collective responsibility, it helped shape the kind of self that perpetuates democracy, a self that is simultaneously independent and interdependent. He says further, democracy needs, at its best, breeds people who have minds of their own. Individual entrepreneurship and personal creativity have given rise to advances in everything from business to technology to the arts. Independent thinking can also get the ship of state back on course when ideological conformism leads us astray. And yet, anyone who does not understand that the self is interdependent with others does not understand what it takes to be entrepreneurial or creative and political, let alone what it means to be human. We need aware, responsible, and engaged human beings to keep the ship of democracy from being smashed by the waves of fascism and injustice. In episode 3 of our story, Jonah eventually stood up and said he was the problem, told the sailors that's why they were experiencing this storm, because of his attempt to run away from what God had directed him to do. He realized his connection and responsibility to the whole. So he told the sailors, to throw him in the sea to try to stop the storm. Some scholars suggest that this was not necessarily a move to help the situation, but another way for Jonah to avoid going to Nineveh. He would rather die in the ocean than to do what he was directed to do. To Jonah, death was better than going to Nineveh. The sailors, however, did not want to kill anyone, so they continued to work their theological solution by calling on their gods while fighting against the storm. The sailors did their best to follow a love-based response. They did not want to kill Jonah by throwing him into the sea. So they tried to hang on to hope while the storm kept raging. At that point, though, they had joined Jonah in avoiding what God had directed him to do. After battling against the worsening storm, things began to look hopeless. The sailors had no choice left but to follow God's plan and throw Jonah overboard. I'm reminded of the words of Vaclav Havel, who said, "Isn't it the moment of most profound doubt that gives birth to new certainties? Perhaps hopelessness is the very soil that nourishes human hope. Perhaps one could never find sense in self without first experiencing its absurdity." The storm ceased when the sailors threw Jonah into the water. Although they had just experienced a terrifying ordeal, in the end, the sailors were able to undergo a profound transformation. They made a spiritual shift to believe in Jonah's God, because when all else failed, that God saved their life. In the worst of circumstances, even something positive can still be realized. Hermann Hesse said, "I have always believed and still believe that whatever good or bad fortune may come our way, we can always give it meaning and transform it into something of value." We are all living through a period of socio-political storms. It seems like just when we think things can't get any worse, something even more crazy comes our way. Over the past 3.5 years, some of us have been crying out to God, "Where are you? Can't you make this storm cease?" Some of us have had to ask the same of our personal lives in the gale force winds of sickness or relationship troubles or unemployment or the many other issues that hit us in our storms. We ask, "God, where are you?" There are times when we must be like the sailors on Jonah's ship, throwing away our doubts and our fears, throwing them overboard while keeping hope and love at the forefront of our imaginations. The storms will eventually cease, and/or we will be transformed in the process. At the end of his book, Parker Palmer reminds us of these words of Reinhold Niebuhr that say, nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true and beautiful or good make complete sense in any immediate context in history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. The God of love never leaves us and will direct us to where we need to be. Always follow L3, meaning let love lead. It will not always be easy, but it will always be right. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. Join us next week at 10 a.m. Eastern Time via Zoom. Send me an email to drkathy100 at gmail.com. That's DRKATHI 100 at gmail.com. And I'll send you the information so you can join by Zoom. Well, have a great week.